So a new Saw installment has been released, and I wasn't overly keen on watching more movies from this franchise, despite it being one of my favorites, mainly because it was overdone many times over the years, and was milked until there was nothing left to offer from it. But I still wanted to see this one for myself anyway. I mean, why not? Especially since it includes the return of the man, the myth, and the legend himself, John Kramer.
Oh yes, there will be blood.
I was skeptical first, however, about how he was going to return, because the last time we saw him was in Jigsaw, and his appearance was a flashback from 10 years before the present events were happening in that movie. So I thought that this one might take the same route, where the incidents and story are happening in the present, but his appearance will be in some flashback to tie in with the contemporaneous story. It turned out, however, that the events of this movie are somewhere between the first and third parts, and I mentioned in my review of Spiral from the Book of Saw how the first 3 parts were the best in my opinion, in terms of producing a solid, consistent story with a beginning and an end. But after that, everything went downhill in the later installments, with the overcomplicated and convoluted scenarios, and how the movies themselves became more about torture porn, rather than presenting a good continuing scenario. Jigsaw and Spiral movies were not that bad, though I would say the worst was Spiral out of all of the Saw movies, mainly because the story was very predictable, and I knew who the perpetrator was before halfway into the movie, and also because the Jigsaw voice was not as intimidating as before. It didn't have Tobin Bell's charismatic and callous voice in the recordings.
Hello, Detective Boswick. I want to play a game.
But anyway, before we get into this review, a quick reminder first of heavy spoilers coming ahead. So if you haven't seen it yet, you know what to expect.
Live or die, the choice is yours.
This story basically brings us back to the time of John, Amanda, and Detective Hoffman, who makes an appearance in the post-credit scene. And it happens in their early times when they were still working together. Now, one of the most glaring issues with this was the age gap between the actors and the characters they portrayed. It's been nearly 20 years since the events of the first 3 Saw films happened, and the actors have aged noticeably. So seeing them now in their older selves, playing characters who are supposed to be 20 years younger, doesn't go well with the story and film, as the age discrepancy here creates a sense of unreality, making it difficult to immerse yourself in the story. The other issues I had with this were the pacing, sequences, and dialogues. They were all on a much lower level from what we have seen in the earlier movies. The acting, while not entirely terrible, was also a notch below what we've come to expect from the Saw franchise. Tobin Bell and Shawnee Smith, as always, deliver solid performances, but some of the supporting cast struggles to keep up. Their acting feels uninspired and lacks the intensity that the film's premise demands. The dialogue, however, was a significant letdown. It was often bland, generic, and sometimes even cheesy, lacking the sharp wit and edge that characterized the earlier films, and the characters' exchanges and dialogues also felt forced and unnatural.
Not a chance. You know, I'd die for you, baby.
The sequences of events and incidents in the film were often too convenient as well, straining the viewer's suspension of disbelief. For instance, when the fake doctor and her partner managed to lock John with the chains, but all of a sudden the child Carlos just appears to be playing football past the middle of the night when it's almost morning near an abandoned building with no supervision, which somehow makes for the perfect setup of the plan for John. And then after the doctor's partner turns on the machine and watches John and Carlos get blood-boarded before rushing to the control room to grab the cash, which sets off their trap, I kept wondering at that moment, what if they didn't go there in time? What if they stayed and watched John and the child until they are both dead, and then killed Amanda too? What if they simply shot them all without putting anyone in that machine? And what if Carlos didn't even appear in that moment at night? Now that doesn't sound like a well-crafted master plan, like the ones we've seen from John, as he's always 3 steps ahead of those he's testing. But everything here seemed to play out quite conveniently for our protagonists, and this level of overstretched convenience makes it hard for me to believe in the motives and inspiring goal of the protagonist, and I could not take the film seriously at that point. In the end, the overall production of Saw X exudes a B-movie feel, with its uninspired dialogue, inconvenient and over-convenient pacing, as well as its questionable sequences. The film lacks the thrill and intensity of its predecessors, resembling a direct-to-DVD offering, rather than a theatrical release. The lack of attention to detail and the overall lackluster execution hinder the film's ability to captivate and engage the viewer. I'm surprised that this movie was so poorly done, especially since it was directed by Kevin Grutard, who directed both the 6th and 7th parts, even though they were not as good as the first 3, but they still had better production, dialogues, and scenarios than this one, and I did enjoy them too. The only aspects that maintained this movie on a good watchable level were the performances of Tobin and Shawnee, the creativity of the traps, as well as the intense levels of gore that seem to be well preserved as the signature of this movie. Oh, and by the way, of all the usual twists that are anticipated at the end of each Saw film, this one was the worst. And for all of that, I'm giving this one 4 out of 10. In the end, let me know, what did y'all think about this one, and how much would you rate it for yourself? Do you think that this movie is a good addition to the Saw franchise, or do you feel that it shouldn't have been made in the first place? And are you excited that there's a new part coming out this year, or do you also think that you have seen enough of Saw movies for now? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and I would very much like to read what you have to say about it. And until I see y'all in the next video, thank you very much for watching, have a splendid day, and peace out.